Business storytelling. A lot of people talk about it, but not a lot of people do it. It's one of the most powerful things out there. I mean, it transforms businesses, but if you do it bad, it's friggin' annoying. So I'm going to talk about the 6 traits of a great business storyteller. 6 habits, let's call it. But before we get into that, let's think about the greatest storytellers out there, right? Who were they? Walt Disney. Well, I know you think right away of Walt Disney making a great movie, but it was more than that. He had to sell the story all along the way. They were constantly getting loans. He was constantly getting investors. He went to 3-4 different people to invest in the World's Fair. He went to 3-4 different people to invest in Disneyland. People rejected him left and right. He went to 3-4 different big companies to invest in Epcot, left and right. Rejected. But he had this vision, and he had to sell the story. Not only that, Walt had to convince people to do things that they didn't know they were able to do. One of my favorite stories is I got to meet Bob Gurr. And thanks to my buddy Scott Gray, we got to go this talk about Bob Gurr talking about the making of Disney World. It was absolutely amazing. If you don't know who Bob Gurr was, here's a picture of me and Bob Gurr. And Jeffrey Barnes, who's also another Disney expert. And Bob got up there and talked about Walt. And Walt inspired him. Walt made Bob able to design the car, design the monorail. Walt convinced Bob to make the first indoor roller coaster on rails, the Matterhorn. Right? All these amazing things. And Walt inspired people to do this, not by telling them, hey, you got to do this. He told them stories. Stories inspire your team. Stories can be simple. Right? Another great one, Steve Jobs. I love it. I mean, for all things we don't like about him, he was an amazing storyteller. Because he told the story of how the computers are going to work. And he told the story of the people, of what they were going to do for people. Stories can change everything. But what do you have to do to be a great storyteller? Now, the storytelling part of it is always learned. We are made to listening to stories, right? We grow up listening to stories. So we know a great story when we hear it, when we see it. But we don't know how to tell it. But in your business, I see this all the time. People say they want to be great storytellers, but they don't take the time to learn it, take the time to do it, take the time to devote to it. And it's one of those things that will differentiate your business. And you know, over the years, I've learned not only how to tell great stories, I think, people listen to me. I know we've created some beautiful stories for our clients, but also to hear the elements of great stories. So let's talk about the traits, the habits that you need to develop to be a great storyteller. The first thing you need to do to be a great storyteller is to know your audience. What's that mean, knowing your audience? Well, know who you're talking to. And not going, hey, my audience is 35-year-old men, right? That's not your audience. You've got to know the people. That's why, stand-up comedians, they don't do stand-up comedy into a vacuum. It's almost impossible to do stand-up comedy like this, right? Because you're not getting a reaction. They know their audience, and they go test out materials, and they test out the audience. And if you go see a great stand-up comedian in 4 different venues, it's going to be slightly different at 4 different venues. Some of the stuff will be the same, but the great ones play off the audience. They know their audience. So in this case, you have to know who you're talking to. Have a person in your head. Gary Vaynerchuk talks about that person. Know who you're talking to. Know who you're talking to. Because a little side note, what that's going to help you to do is get out of your head of being about you. It's about them. When another agency owner was talking about it, and she's like, I don't want to be a douchebag doing videos, right? Well, you're going to feel like a douchebag if you go watch douchebags and the marketing that they do kind of sucks, but it gets a lot of attention. Now, people do stuff to get a lot of attention, and there's stupid stuff that you can do to grab attention. But if you really get into helping your audience and know your audience, you're going to be a good storyteller. So know your audience. Next up, in helping them have a point to your story, right? I've got a friend who will start telling a story, and literally 20 minutes later, I'm like, what were we talking about? We all have that friend, right? So know your story. Know what it's gonna do. What's the point of it? Do we want someone? What type of emotion do we want them to have? Do we want them to laugh? Do we want them to cry? Is there something we want to get across? A message that we want to get across. Don't be a bad storyteller, right? If you get those two things right, you're gonna be a decent storyteller. Now, how do we go from good to great storyteller? Well, in business, we have to decide what we want the story to do. Now, we had a point to the story, but now we want an action that the story is going to take, right? We want the story, someone to do something on the other side of the story. Do you want them to subscribe? Well, why does this story lead to more subscriptions? Do you want them to call you? Do you want them to watch another video? Do you want them to comment? Do you want them to subscribe to your email list? Do you want them to go to another page on your website? Do you want them to tell someone else? The problem is that a lot of people will try and cram all that into one story. And I see this all the time. I've been guilty of it. I'm like, hey, subscribe, go on our email list, go to blah, 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 blah. You know, and side note, if you want to be a great storyteller, you probably should subscribe to this, because I'm going to be telling you what I know about storytelling, and hopefully it will help you. I've been doing it for a long time, since I was like 7. Anyways, so we have that call to action. We figure out what we want the story to do. And a side note, that's probably one of the first things that you should do. It is definitely one of the first things you should do. I mean, that's what we always start with strategy. Because it's really hard to be getting down the story and then have a point to it, and then we're like, I want them to subscribe. Now it's not a good story anymore, because it's just going to be like, shift brakes, grind the gears, and we've all said that, and then the really good story becomes a bad story. So know your audience, have a point, get to calls to action. Now, the best storytellers also understand the situation. They understand the environment. So not only knowing the audience, knowing the environment. I talk about this all the time, situation marketing. You know your audience, like, hey, it's my family. You know, we're going to tell some family jokes. I'm going to tell some jokes about my aunt over there. It's going to be hilarious. But if it's at a funeral and it's inappropriate, it doesn't work. And it's an extreme example, but you have to know the situation. And once we get into digital marketing and storytelling, you have to understand the platform, right? The platform, if it's Facebook, people are on Facebook for a different reason than, hey, you're watching this on YouTube. It's a different reason than people are on TikTok. People are on TikTok to be entertained, right? Scrolling. Yes, you have to interrupt them. It has to be entertaining. You have to get them. You have to understand why your audience is there. If you're on LinkedIn, different audience. It could be the same people, but they're there for a different reason, right? So it's a different place. So understand the situation. Time of day, right? I am a completely different person in the morning than I am. I'm filming this in the afternoon right now. A little drained, but you have to understand that the time of day. So the more you can get to know that, and I put this later on. This is super important to great storytellers, but especially in digital marketing, it becomes a little tougher. But if you did those first few things, you're going to be really good. Now, so we understand the situation. We have a call to action. We have a point to the story. We know who we're talking to. Next up, I want to develop a lot of stories. I want to collect a lot of stories. The best salesperson I knew, the best salespeople I know, collected stories, right? I remember one at a sales convention, I tell this all the time, that the best salesperson out there just went around collecting stories. If you have an arsenal or a tackle box of stories, you're going to have the right story to fit that audience, to fit the situation, to fit that point, to get that call to action. And guess what? If you're hiring salespeople, if you're training salespeople, you're working with a new marketing team, they're going to love that you have a ton of stories. But you should have a collection of stories. Now, do not use all the stories at once. Once I became a better storyteller in business, I would queue up 6-7 stories that I thought were good to ready to show. And stories can also be examples. But I mean, those are great stories, right? Here's an example of a website that we built. Here's an example of a person that we helped. Let me show you their picture and tell you their story. Now, obviously, you can have the videos too, but you want to have a collection of them. And each person has, when we do case stories, there's several stories within the stories. So you can start quickly building up this whole big collection of stories. And you should have personal stories too, right? Ready to go. The more of those personal stories you have, the better off your storytelling is going to be. So now we're collecting stories. You know your audience. You have a point to the story. Please, man, have a point to the story. If I have to tell you that your story doesn't have a point, man, that sucks. And I guarantee you, if people are dropping off your videos, your stories don't have a point. Know what you want the story to do, right? Know what you want the story to do. Know the situation. Have a collection of stories. And finally, this is the easiest one, but also the hardest one. Tell stories. Make all of this a part of your routine, a part of your habit. Tell the stories. Get out there and tell the stories. All right, coming back to the stand-up comedy analogy. What do? They get up and tell the stories over and over and over again. I took a few stand-up comedy classes. I wasn't good. But I did learn that the story evolves. And the more feedback you get, the better you get at storytelling. Right? The more feedback we get, the more stories you tell, the better storyteller you're going to become. This is a lot of work. It is, but in all these world of marketing and sales, in humanity, nothing has won more than the best storyteller. The best storyteller will always win. Always. Because it is about that, about telling stories, about being consistent, about having a collection of them, getting them out there, understand the situation, understand the audience, understand your point, understand the call to action, and making it better and better and better and better. And then you can get into hooks and angles and all these other things. But if you aren't telling great stories, someone else is, and you're going to end up losing. But if you are telling great stories, you're going to attract the right people. You're going to enjoy your business more. It becomes easier and easier to tell great stories, especially if you're collecting them, crafting them, and have a whole collection of them. So if you want to get better at storytelling, please subscribe. My point is that I want you to understand that storytelling is something that can be learned. It's something you can be better at. I do want you to subscribe. And, if you need help telling your customer stories, well, you know where to come. All right. I challenge you. Shoot a video. Tell a story. Put a link down below in the comments. Let me know how it goes.